This is Chapter 7, Screencast 2, talking about residential land, and we mentioned on a previous screencast that residential land in the United States comprises only 4% of the land use, but this use of land does have consequences for the environment, and as you see here, the use of residential land is expanding rapidly. That's in the United States and worldwide. And the reason residential land use is expanding rapidly is due to population increases. So we have three definitions of concentrations of residential land: urban, suburban, and exurban. Urban is defined as greater than 1,000 people per square mile. Suburban is defined as a lower population density than the 1,000 people per square mile, but an area that surrounds a metropolitan or an urban area. Last, we have exurban. It's similar to suburban areas in concentration, but unconnected to any central city or densely populated area. So, for example, the city of Boston would be considered an urban area. Towns that surround Boston, such as Milton, would be considered a suburban area, surrounding the city of Boston, but a lower population density. And towns on Cape Cod would be considered exurban, because we don't surround a major urban center such as Boston. We have similar population densities to suburban areas, but we're not connected to any central city. Since 1950, more than 90% of population growth in metropolitan areas has occurred in the suburbs. And what happens in many cities, it hasn't happened so much in Boston, but in many cities we get we have an urban sprawl from Boston, but then after urban sprawl sometimes comes urban blight. So let's take a look at those concepts. So urban sprawl is when people move out of a center of a city and spread out further and further and eventually into the suburbs. And automobiles and highway construction are a big factor that led to urban sprawl in the United States. So once people had automobiles, they were able to get into work, for example, in the city by driving a car in instead of taking the bus or relying on public transportation. The government's actually constructed highways on purpose to allow people to expand into the suburbs. And of course, nowadays, people not only have one car per family, many families have more than one car. So that led to or allowed for urban sprawl. Secondly, living costs led people to move further from the city. They could get more land and a larger house in the suburbs for usually the same amount of money as you would have in the city. So one of the problems with this is then it leads to urban blight, which we'll look at on the next slide. But as people move out of the city revenue shrinks, and then the city becomes more poor. So we'll look at that in just a minute. And that drives more people further into the suburbs. Also, some government policies encourage people to live more in the suburbs than the cities. So let's take a look at how urban sprawl can lead to urban blight. We'll start here with population shifts to the suburbs. You see the green arrow. As people shift to the suburbs, the city does not have as much income tax or real estate tax, and therefore the tax revenues decline. With declining tax revenues, they have to cut services such as transportation, trash pickup, those types of things, money that went into schools. All of that needs to start to be cut, which then leads to fewer customers, and because customers are in the suburbs, and then businesses leave. And so that even further reduces the tax revenue. Eventually, neighborhoods decline. They don't have the same income tax, so the schools aren't as good. They don't have shopping areas and things like that. And so this becomes a negative feedback loop this becomes a positive feedback loop, which I wanted to point out does not mean it's a positive effect. It means that this shift continues to spiral and spiral and spiral and just increase. So that is a positive feedback loop. So some areas have tried to prevent that from happening through planned development. So let's take a look at that. So let's take a look at smart growth or planned development. Sometimes areas can be designated through something called zoning. It's a planning tool to create quieter and safer communities. So it says what can be allowed in a particular zone. This zone is for industry. This zone is for residential. That can be a positive thing, but it can also lead to growth that is not smart. Sometimes it's actually better to have integrated communities. So let's take a look at that. Smart growth focuses on strategies that encourage the development of sustainable, healthy communities. And the basic principles of smart growth include mixed land uses within one area, a range of housing opportunities and price ranges, and walkable neighborhoods where car ownership is not necessary, or is at least the amount of driving around is reduced. So in the United States, we've had a lot of problems with doing that, particularly on the Cape here. We do not have or did not have a range of housing opportunities, a range of price ranges. And we ended up pricing out working folks as the price of housing that people who were purchasing it as second homes increased the price, the value, then there were no longer housing opportunities. And then since there were no longer housing opportunities, the number of families decreased because families needed to move to areas where it's less expensive. And therefore, the enrollment in our schools declined and continues to decline. So these kinds of things can cause an issue. Some places, though, have tried to correct for this issue. Here in Cape Cod, we're trying to correct for having a range of housing opportunities and have purposely built some that are more affordable in each town. I'd like to tell you about a town in Maryland called Columbia, Maryland. It's sort of a suburb of Washington, D.C., and it was planned in the mid-1960s by a gentleman named James Rouse, and he pre-planned everything in this city, and he pre-planned 10 self-contained villages that were walkable, so you could go shopping and local grocery stores. He limited the number of gas stations in each of the communities, for example. He put these self-contained villages around a central village with a mall, so people would not have to travel as far. And his basic underlying goal was to eliminate any racial, religious, or class segregation, which had been going on in the 1950s, and trying to reverse course on that. And it was very successful and continues to be successful. Here's another example, a case study that's in your book called Dudley Street Neighborhood, and I mention it because it is in Boston. And instead of just an individual or a company planning something, and instead of just a government plan for an improved neighborhood or improved smart growth, this was actually a coalition of residents who worked together to clean up the neighborhood. They worked out some cost-saving grants for solar panels, for example, and they did many things to make their community livable, walkable, and desirable. So it's a little upbeat news. Okay, now I just want to talk, before we head into the agriculture section, about a couple of terms that are not in your textbook. And this is about food insecurity. So even in the United States, and certainly globally, you can have one of these three states of nutrition. One is undernutrition, which is when there are not enough calories in the diet to maintain health. so that's specific to calories. Malnourishment is when there aren't the proper amounts of proteins, carbs, in particularly vitamins and minerals. So we'll talk about that as we talk about genetically modified organisms, but people can have very serious health effects from not having particular vitamins or proteins in their diet. A third issue is overnutrition, where a community may be intaking too many calories, and we're certainly familiar with that as well. So I'm going to stop here and move on to agriculture as a separate video or screencast.